Hi. Do you find your moment-to-moment experience to hinge on what you're thinking right now? Do you carry around a feeling of inner pain, malaise, or otherwise a sense of suffering? Do you find that the more you learn about and think about narcissistic abuse, the less free from it you end up feeling? And finally, do you find yourself having to operate more like a human doing than a human being? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, then I hope today's video can be helpful. I want to discuss the difference between feeling like a human doing versus a human being, as it applies to the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse. First, I'm going to describe how and why human doing mode is a thought of way of living that can become by honestly in the course of narcissistic abuse for the scapegoat survivor. Then I'll contrast this with what living in the present moment can offer. And if you watch until the end, I'll offer a way to notice when you're moving away from being in this moment and into or towards thinking or doing mode. This tactic can allow you to get reacquainted with yourself as you actually are, rather than strictly as you think of yourself. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and I specialize in understanding and helping people who have survived narcissistic abuse by a parent or a partner, particularly those thrust into the role of scapegoat by the narcissistic abuser. So in therapy and through my online course, we work together to gain clarity on what happened, promote distance from the narcissistic abuser, and generate support and evidence for living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. But first, if you haven't already, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. And if you turn the notifications on, you'll get notified every time a new video is posted. So to zoom out a bit first, there's always more happening right now in this moment than we can think or say about what is happening right now in this moment. So there's a gap, right, between what's happening and what can be thought about what's happening. And people have been noticing this for ages, from the Buddhists to philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, and more recently, Eckhart Tolle. They have found that human suffering, or you can think of it as disordered consciousness, can come about when the tail of what we think about our experience wags the dog of what our experience actually is in this particular moment. The philosopher I mentioned, Jean-Paul Sartre, calls this bad faith. Eckhart Tolle might call it moving away from our present experience. And I think this will become more clear as I get into this. Well, why is the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse tempted and pressured so often to think more than just be? Well, in order to be, one has to be oriented to discover in each unfolding moment what is in their immediate experience. To do this, it has to feel okay and safe enough to discover what is there. So a child who's got a good enough parent can take a wait-and-see approach to his inner life. He doesn't have to tell himself via thinking what is happening or what happened or what is going to happen. He can notice what he's experiencing right now and spontaneously express it as what's inside moves him to. And he can trust that his parent will generally be available, curious, and intact themselves if and when he needs them. Now let's contrast that with a child who's often blamed for his narcissistic parents' frustrations, i.e. the scapegoat. Now let's say this child falls down and scrapes her knee, and her narcissistic mother is angry at the child's need for care in this moment because the mother had intended to go run an important errand for herself. Well, this mother may yell at and accuse the child of not being careful enough and call her selfish, along with expressing disdain and exasperation at having to attend to the child in an attitudinal way towards the child. Well, after this kind of episode, if the child pays attention to her own inner experience in this wait-and-see kind of way, then she could experience from within all kinds of agonies over how she doesn't have someone she can depend on, nor someone who seems to care about her safety. And if she did this, there'd also be nobody to comfort her. So what this young girl may have to do is adapt to this ongoing situation by moving away from her immediate experience as it's given to her in the present moment and into a more thought-based form of experience. Maybe she forcefully tells herself something like, "You're so bad. Mommy loves you and you just have to mess everything up for her." Well, then this young girl will have to keep telling herself thoughts along these lines, because as soon as she stops thinking these thoughts, that other agonizing from within inner experience can creep up again, that she doesn't have anyone she can depend on, nor someone who cares about her safety. So this young girl has to think and think and think in ways that claim she's bad, and learn to identify over time with these thoughts, identify herself almost as these thoughts. And eventually her identity can be a thought of identity, as opposed to a source of self in the world that begins in the present moment, like the child in the former example with the good enough parent had a much better shot at enjoying. Well, what happens when the scapegoated child of the narcissistic parent has to move towards a thought of identity in this manner? Well, a thought of self or identity is fragile by nature. It exists via thinking. So if we're not thinking, then it can feel like we don't have a self or even don't exist. And the rabbit hole can grow deeper when we feel as though we only exist when thinking certain thoughts. So like the example with the little girl with the narcissistic mother, she may feel like she's only existent to herself when she's thinking poorly of herself, in the manner described earlier. And this can all result in it feeling like it requires a continual effort to produce and think the right thoughts in order to have a sense of life and continuity in life. This can be why learning and thinking so much about narcissistic abuse can result in feeling stuck nonetheless. That despite our best efforts, it can function in a way that reinforces our attachment to this thought-based identity of having to think more and more thoughts to counteract other thoughts. Now, there's I think an important place in the recovery process for this, but I did want to shine a light on this experience where the more one seems to learn about narcissistic abuse, the less free from it one might feel. And I'll offer a tactic for addressing this later on in the video. So although this kind of thought of experience and even identity is artificial in nature, it can be necessary to identify with while experiencing narcissistic abuse as a scapegoat. So as I mentioned, a thought of identity or self is threatened by gaps in it, when in essence one is not thinking to keep it going. But gaps in thought are a necessary part of life. Like if you've ever tried to kind of exercise at your full potential and try to think deep thoughts, it's like oil and water, it doesn't work. And yet, for the person who's been narcissistically abused in this manner and has this inner experience, it's a real conflict, because to let go of thinking can feel as though one's sinking into an emptiness or a nothingness. But to keep thinking while trying to engage in other modes of living can be quite difficult and make it hard to live with a sense of ease. But it's quite a dilemma, because in either direction, it can feel painful and scary. And pointedly, I think for the scapegoated child, the more identified he or she is with the thought of self, the more pain he or she is doomed to experience, not just at the hands of the narcissistic abuser, but once this sort of way of coping is in place, it can make one's inner experience feel very unwelcome in an ongoing way inside. But to illustrate the dilemma a little further, it's sort of like, I don't want to float off into oblivion, i.e. I don't want to stop thinking my thoughts and feel as though I don't have an identity then. So let's say in this example, I'm going to cling to this life preserver here, like a life preserver you throw from a boat. And we can think of that as this sort of thought of identity. But in this example, that life preserver has spikes all over it, metal spikes. And it hurts a lot to hang on to that life preserver, but it can feel necessary and required because it's better than sinking into the oblivion that the scapegoated survivor and child at the time can fear will happen if they don't keep clinging to this life preserver, as it were. Well, recovery involves taking the risk of letting go of that life preserver and discovering that one is now standing on solid ground. each person, each survivor can only make this discovery for him or herself. It can't be done in thought, but rather must happen in experience. And I want to make a comment on, as I'm laying out how this kind of way of experiencing life can develop for the scapegoated survivor, it's a further testament to the grit and resilience that a scapegoated individual, I think, possesses. That, to keep on going in the face of this type of pain internally, I mean, it's remarkable. And it's also unremarked on for the survivor. They are sort of the sole person who knows what it's like to experience this. Well, I'd like to get more into the details of why the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse can feel so identified with their thought of experience. Well, as you'll know from other videos, a narcissistic abuser has to find the scapegoated child as the worthless one in the relationship, because that narcissistic parent actually carries a sense of worthlessness themselves but cannot bear to acknowledge that. So instead, they relocate that worthlessness into the scapegoated child, pressures that child to think and act in compliance with that worthlessness. Well, this is all a fiction and can only be maintained for the scapegoat by going away from that child's being and present experience and towards his or her thought processes. And here's why. So the scapegoated child, I think at a core level, knows he or she is not as bad as a narcissistic parent insists. But the child can't know him or herself in any other way if he or she is going to stay in relationship to that narcissistic parent. Now, this requires a lot of investment in the scapegoated child's thought of identity and experience over their present moment experience that I'm going to continue to just call their being. And this investment is initially made to prevent the catastrophic loss for the child of the parent when that parent is all he or she has. And as that investment goes on, the scapegoat can feel internally identified with this sort of thought of self or identity, so that the scapegoated child at the time fears that losing that identity will mean losing his or her self. The scapegoated child's adoption of a sort of thought of identity of themselves and sort of turning their attention away from their immediate experience can also be very much reinforced by the narcissistic parent, because the child's not being seen and mirrored for and loved for who she sort of is in the world, her being in the world. That scapegoated child's only being quasi-seen or recognized when the child's merged with her thoughts, right? When the child's thinking of herself as that narcissistic parent is insisting the child is. But it's all a thought-based exchange between the narcissistic parent and the scapegoated child. The child is not seen or loved for her being in the world. Instead, the child is only seen or recognized by the narcissistic parent when she's merged with her thoughts. And those are thoughts that converge with how the narcissistic parent needs to see that child. And importantly, I would submit that the narcissistic parent is very much, if not constantly, in this thought of mode of existing, because everything they're doing is an effort to get away from their immediate experience of who they are due to how painful it is to them. So for example, a narcissistic parent who is merged with this thought-based experience may try to actualize the thought of identity that he is supremely important to himself and to others. So to have a relationship with this parent, his child must then think and then merge with thoughts that echo his parent's thoughts in this way. So something like, oh wow, look how important dad is. I could never measure up to him. He's the best. So the child has to move away from any of his present experience that might diverge from this thought state that complies with his narcissistic father's thought of identity. Some of the things the child will have to move away from is that child's own sense of power and effectiveness in the world, because that could threaten the narcissistic father's ability to believe his own thoughts. And for that narcissistic father not to be able to believe those thoughts would be a threat to his sense of his own identity. When this type of dynamic happens enough and the child's only option for an identity is such thought-based activity, then it can feel very fragile for that child to go out in the world. Like life's daily goings on can make such a fragile inner arrangement feel very painful, and the outcome can constantly feel uncertain. In essence, sort of the child can feel like how he knows himself is going to depend on what thoughts he's thinking about himself. So if he sees like a classmate look at him sideways, he might have the thought, oh, that person hates me. And it's not like, oh, I am having the thought that maybe that person, that my friend hates me now, but rather I am being hated. And so that might change once he goes and talks with that friend. But still, his fortunes can feel like they're always up in the air based upon what thought he's going to have next about himself, about his worth to others, and so on. And when life can feel perilous in this way, because one's had to kind of develop a thought of identity, this can result in the child actually seeking reunion with the narcissistically abusive parent, because at least in that case, there's some reinforcement of the child's thought about identity. And this temporary sort of restitution of their thought of identity can stave off that dreaded loss of identity that can be felt to be unsurvivable while it's happening for the child. But ultimately, kind of going back to the well with the narcissistic abuser in this way, leaves the child feeling empty and in need of sort of constant replenishment. I think this can be one way why it can be so difficult to extricate oneself from the relationship with a narcissistic abuser, because it's kind of like going away from a self that one has known oneself to be and finding new and different firm ground to stand on. Well, I want to give an example of how a scapegoat survivor recalled having to choose a thought-based identity over kind of acting from his present moment of being. Well, this is the anonymous example of John, who in the course of therapy remembered how when he was in second grade, he took particular pride in learning how to write cursive in handwriting. He focused and concentrated fully on the task of writing new letters and words during the week in the classroom. And every Friday, he and his second grade classmates would take a cursive writing test that John always tried his best at. At the same time, John was getting more pressured to think of himself the way his narcissistically abusive mother was treating him. He recalled her constantly finding fault in what he did or did not do around the house, and he grew to feel that his thought of identity must be someone who is rotten and who can't do anything right. Well, in therapy, John recalled a critical moment when he went away from his being in the present moment in somewhat of a decisive manner, and much more towards his thought of identity. He remembered that his grandparents were in town as Christmas was approaching, and that Friday after school, the plan was to open the gifts they had brought. Well, John knew that he was getting the Transformer toy known as Shockwave. And as he was in his classroom that day taking his cursive test, he found his mind going away from trying to write the cursive as best he could and towards thinking about what it'd be like to play with Shockwave later that evening. And in doing so, he recalled how it made the present moment of writing his cursive feel a lot less worthwhile than what it would feel like to get the toy and play with it. So he stopped efforting as hard as he could to write and just kind of scribbled the rest of it. Then sat back in his chair and kind of reveled over what it'd be like to play with the toy later. And in therapy, he knew that something very sacred within him had been compromised, but he also knew there was no other choice for him at that time. I wanted to describe this example to illustrate how John, as a scapegoat to his narcissistic mother, had to abandon his present moment experience of writing the cursive test and something he cared about to comply with the ways she was pressuring him to adopt the identity that was based on her distorted thinking rather than who he is in his being in that present moment. Because for John to have continued writing his cursive test in earnestness would have resulted in losing the thought of identity that was being foisted upon him as someone who was lazy or no good, And for John, at the time, that felt scarier than the hit to his self-worth and sense of integrity in not being able to try his hardest at something he cared about, the writing in cursive. If you've had an example like John's, where you felt like you had to go away from yourself sort of as you are and into a more thought of way of experiencing yourself, I encourage you to write that in the comments below. So, to the exercise or tactic of how to begin to disidentify with one's thought of identity or self and increase connection to your being here and now. Well, if you are a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent, before getting into this exercise, I cannot stress enough the importance of achieving emotional, psychological, and maybe even physical distance from this person so that the old sort of thought-based tactics are not reinforced or felt to be necessary today. With that being said, this tactic involves noticing what you are thinking without trying to change the thoughts and work to notice yourself as the noticer or the watcher. It's the part of you that is watching that is the part that is being. And this is taken from Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now book. When we are fully identified with our thought of experience, it's very difficult to observe ourselves doing so. And one important way to notice when we're wholly in our thoughts is to see if we find ourselves moving into the future or towards the past with our thoughts. Then the task is simply to notice, not necessarily by saying words to ourselves, but sort of notice, bring our attention to that fact. And I'm going to say it in words just because it's easy to illustrate, but it could be something like, oh, I'm in the future, or oh, I'm in the past. But again, if you could translate that somehow to just how you're paying attention, that is the practice. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of using this tactic with patience and compassion towards yourself, because this thought of existence, again, was psychologically necessary to get to where you are today. And I think Tolle would claim that, if we can attend to the fact that our thoughts are somewhere other than right here and right now, when that happens, it transforms the nature of our experience because we're not fused with the thought. And gradually our identity gets to expand beyond what we're thinking to something bigger and richer and here right now. And that's where the words sort of break down, where they don't do a great job of describing it, because as I mentioned at the start of the video, words can't capture all that this moment has to offer. And by noticing our thoughts as they're happening, we get closer to this present moment of being. Well, I hope today's topic resonated and felt understandable. I think it's somewhat of a subtle, maybe tricky experience to grasp, but if it resonates with your experience of your moment-to-moment life, I hope there's some relief in having some explanation for it. And with that, I want to invite you, if you haven't already, to visit my website to check out an ebook on surviving narcissistic abuse as the scapegoated survivor. There's a link to it in the description below, or you can click on the image on the video screen right now. Well, thank you, and I look forward to posting again next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take good care.